is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even accuse them. On that day, when according to my gospel, God judges the secrets of men by Christ Jesus. What is this relationship between civil law and moral law? Even for the Roman culture, all their civil laws were essentially a projection of what they believed to be absolute foundational moral truths that couldn't be changed. Why? Because they were written on their hearts. The Romans were not atheists. They were polytheistic. They had multiple gods, but they believed that there was such a thing as transcendent moral principles that ought to be abided by. They had a sense of what C.S. Lewis referred to as a sense of oughtness, and that we all have. And I don't care whether you come here as a born-again Christian or as a Muslim or as a Jew or an agnostic or an atheist. Every human being that takes a breath on this planet that is able to have process their thoughts has a sense of oughtness. They have a sense that the moral law, there is a moral law, and they may call it their preference for moral law, but they still have a sense of oughtness that they think should transcend, not just for them, but what's right is right for all people. There are certain things that are right for all people and wrong for all people, and that's the way people think. Or do they? That's the way they thought. Do they still think that way? Is the civil law a reflection of a transcendent moral law? Should it be? Paul seemed to think there was a relationship. Even in pagan Rome, ruled by an emperor that required everyone to worship him, there was still a sense in which their laws reflected the law that was written upon their heart, which corresponded to God's higher moral absolute law. What is God's moral absolute law? Of course, you can say, well, the Ten Commandments. Yes, that's true, but what are the Ten Commandments? The Ten Commandments are given to man by God, and those commandments reflect His moral character. All of the Ten Commandments reflect and give credence to the nature of God. It is God's nature to love. It is His nature to love mankind and desire the highest good for mankind. So He gives mankind, in specific the Jews, the Ten Commandments, which are a prescription for receiving His ultimate best. If you do these things, He says to Moses, you will live and you will be blessed. If you do not, you will receive a curse. And these are the things that your nation will experience. And the list is quite long about all the chaos that will ensue. In other words, He gives them a reflection of His moral character and says, live this way. I want your heart to reflect my heart. And if you do these things, then you will essentially love your neighbor, love your spouse. You will embody my moral character, and you'll be blessed, because it is my desire to seek your highest good, and your highest good is to enjoy me, to have fellowship with me, and to live and to walk alongside of me. That's what God's moral law is. The civil law then reflects that, because the civil law, regardless of what government, in essence, are enforced for the good of the common people. For the common good of all people. That's what civil law does. So there is a relationship between God's moral law and man's civil law. Or is there? What about separation of church and state? You see, we're kind of in a cultural twilight zone right now as we're trying to relate to Paul's letter to the church in Rome, and we're trying to apply it to our everyday lives, because Paul writes to the Romans, and he assumes and knows that their civil law essentially reflects a higher moral law, even if they're not Christians. He knows this. This is commonly understood. Yet, here we are in our time, the 21st century, here, and we're trying to flesh this out, and we think that that sounds kind of right, but at the same time, our culture screams, stop! You cannot legislate morality. You must separate religion or any flavor thereof from civil law. These two can't meet. I was watching the news last week, and they were talking about the recent Iowa Supreme Court ruling regarding same-sex marriage. And this particular quote, first of all, I'm getting ahead of myself. Everybody has heard this, I assume. This is what the quote-unquote separation of church and state principle is based upon, the First Amendment, which says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That is supposed to mean, by our culture, that we're supposed to keep civil law as far from moral law as we possibly can, and the two should never touch. They're totally different. They're totally different. And there's no overlap. And one does not influence the other. And that's the predominant view of our culture, which is illustrated by the recent Supreme Court decision to make same-sex marriage legal here in the state of Iowa. And here's what the Supreme Court ruled. This is a quote concerning that ruling. State government can have no religious views. You don't get any clearer than that. That's not at all ambiguous. Either directly or indirectly. So not only directly can they not have any religious moral overtones, they can't even indirectly have any religious moral overtones expressed in its legislation. That's just taboo. You just don't do that. This proposition is the essence of the separation of church and state. See, this ruling clearly illustrates what our culture believes is the relationship between civil law and moral law. In other words, there isn't a relationship. And to try to impose and say that there is to do great damage to the Constitution. That's what you get, according to the Iowa Supreme Court, and let's face it, according to most people in our culture, or many people in our culture, if you allow moral principles that are governed by a theistic, even a monotheistic, and I'm not even talking about biblical Christianity, but any type of monotheistic religion that believes that there is such a thing as absolute morals that have not changed throughout the ages, if you start to bring that into how you govern civil law, you're going to crush the Constitution. And it will do immeasurable harm. Is this news to anybody that this is how our culture operates now? I hope this is not news. Now, you may not have heard this exact quote, but everybody has heard of the mantra, the separation of church and state. I mean, I knew this when I was in junior high. I couldn't quote to you what the First Amendment was, but I could quote to you that there needs to be a separation of church and state.